Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the invitation to comment on two Brazilianist art history research projects, which I find very interesting, which deal with the very interesting period of the 1950s and the 1960s, the years of accelerated modernization in Brazil, driven by a strong will to place Brazil among the modern nations after the Second World War. I think the best example for us all is to remember the construction of the new capital, Brasilia, which attracted worldwide attention. And if we think of Brasilia and her famous architect, Oscar Niemeyer, we can probably find some of the aspects Pauline was speaking about. The constructivist aspect, the rational and the rationalist aspect, the physical and even corporeal space in Brasilia, and the intuitive expressionist aspect of form, which Niemeyer opposed to Western, or let's say just rationalism of Le Corbusier. I do mention this here to remind the broader and interdisciplinary context of concretism and neo-concretism in Brazil, which embraces language and poetry, design, architecture, visual arts, music, and, as we have seen, very different projects like Lina Bobardi's project as well. We can see that there is a language of modernism, of international modernism, Western modernism, in a broad term which encompasses Europe as well as Brazil. Pauline very well mentioned at the beginning of her talk a paradox. If there is an universally understandable formal modernism, where would be the necessity of cultural translation? And this is a question which is also important for Susanne Neubauer's project as well. But all of us know, I believe, that we are constantly trapped in a discussion about cultural difference and cultural contexts, even when we speak about those extremely interesting years of international modernist phenomena in Brazil. For example, Pauline, you showed very well that the materiality of the book or of the art object realized by Brazilian artists, Ligia Pape, Ligia Clark, Oiticica and others, can be seen from a so-called Western rational point of view as a transgression of constructivist ideas, because these artists subvert the old hierarchy of human senses, putting the space and the physical, the touch on the first level. But, and on the other hand, from a lesser or non-Western point of view, a Brazilian point of view, this same concrete materiality can be conceived simply as a central part of construction itself, which has always a physical, material, corporeal side. My question is this really so, or is it a point of view? And the question for me is, are there really these cultural differences in the 50s and 60s between European art and Brazilian art, which make it necessary to understand possible translation processes? And if so, which translation processes in detail? Or do we essentialize somehow our own gaze on Brazilian art scenes when we put as necessary these translation processes? For example, by strengthening the side of the body, of the physical space, etc. in Brazil. I don't want to enter here really in a broad sense in the translation topic, because this is a very, very broad and complex topic if we speak about cultural translation, because intertextual translation, we know quite well what it is, no? But only quite well. But cultural translation is a very, very difficult and well-discussed field. And my intuition is, just to say 2 points about it, my intuition is that you have a sort of anthropophagic concept of cultural translation, which would be very Brazilian. And in the sense that at the end there is a transcreation. This is the concept of Haroldo de Campos when he spoke about translation processes. I would just like to mention that if you speak about intermedia translation, maybe you should mention one source, Roman Jakobson, who did this work on intersemiotic translation, which would be maybe an important source. The second point is, translation is a cultural practice. I think this is a very interesting point. But I'm wondering if the Sao Paulo group of concretistas did not do the more, let's say, decisive practical work, because they were really translator. They came from poetry. They really devoured the whole literature from all over the world, translating these lyrics into Portuguese. Yeah, they were really great translators, and this interlingual translation was a very important concept for the concrete poets from Rio, so from Sao Paulo. So I'm wondering if the Rio group does not, when you strengthen so much cultural translation, if cultural translation in this case is not a sort of metaphor for transfer, appropriation, transformation, and so on. And here I would like to pass to the example of Ludwig Grote, presented in Susanne Neubauer's talk, and to the question raised by her about the concept and perspective of writing art history. Susanne Neubauer has presented a pioneering research in German archives about German-Brazilian cultural relations in the 50s and 60s. I found this very interesting. She worked especially with personnel and official documents from an important art director and mediator, Ludwig Grote. And it is probably not very surprising that Grote's activities in Brazil in the post-war years and in the early 50s is barely known in art history in Germany, as you said, and probably less or more, I don't know, in Brazil. I don't know what is the situation in Brazil. I wonder, is this due to cultural difference or to the asymmetry, really to cultural difference? This would be the question. Or is it due to asymmetries of perception, sort of blind spots? Because we need another methodology to work on these historical periods. Because these years of post-war are the years of very difficult cultural reconstruction processes all over the world. Until very recently, these difficult years were mainly considered from a national point of view, or under the sign of the Cold War, of Cold War politics. So either or. It is only in very recent years that we can observe a tendency to really work on these years from a transnational point of view, from a transnational and entangled point of view. Remember that whole Europe was very weakened culturally in these years after the catastrophe of the Second World War and National Socialism. So it was a very interesting moment to talk to the other in the so-called, in the allegedly peripheries on eye level, which before was not possible. So this is really due to the very weak situation of Europe in the post-war years. And today, more and more of such relations, like between Germany and Brazil in the context of the Biennale, more and more of such relations can be identified today, and they make clear that there were very interesting cultural, poetic, and artistic intercultural exchanges which were quite ignored during long time, not only in cultural history in general, but also in art history. In art history, maybe even more, because art history during a long time, if I may so, as a non-art historian, I have the impression was very much focused on the classical European tradition. And it would be important to reconsider these post-war years of art history in an entangled perspective in order to understand and to make visible existing cultural practices in this entangled transnational space. To answer some of the questions asked by Susanne at the end of her talk, I would say that Grote's statements are very important reactions in a certain cultural context, but to give a concise and historically balanced judgment about his opinions, reactions, and the outreach of these opinions, it would be important to do a symmetrical work in Brazilian archives on the same topic as well. For example, to investigate the German-Brazilian relations in the very first Biennales de São Paulo, the role of Paul Klee or Arthur Segal, because the perspective of the Brazilian actors, like museum directors, journalists, politicians, etc., will be very important as well. By that, the change of perspectives, the different points of view will become visible. And I think you have to integrate these different voices in a transcultural study, which focuses precisely these different contexts. In all, I think it's important to do a very concise and a very complex historical work about these entangled histories and to take into consideration possible cultural political asymmetries and to avoid by that any risk to re-essentialize cultural differences. So, thank you.
Susanne, we're now open for questions. 10, 15 minutes. Please, who would like to begin? Michael, Lena?
Yes, just following on from, I agree entirely with the suggestion that Susanne could counterbalance her excellent research with looking at archives from the Brazilian side. And I wonder if within that kind of idea, whether you considered looking at Mari Pedrosa's stay in was it Berlin? Yeah. Which was hugely influential in terms of his future career as an art critic. It's where he studied Gestalt psychology, and where he was kind of on his return would engage with kind of a fight with people from Arthur Segal's generation, particularly de Cavalcanti, in terms of the abstraction, figuration, national, international, American, Brazilian kind of dialectics. The other point I wanted to make in terms of the response, perhaps, and that way kind of going back to the paper, is I don't quite agree with this kind of quite commonly made association between Brasilia, the architecture, and the constructivist avant-gardes of the 1950s. I find that it kind of simplifies the kind of reading of modernity and modernism in Brazil, and kind of denies the possibility of understanding Brazilian modernism as a conjunction of several different genealogies of modernism. And we've had this afternoon a few examples, such as the kind of the Italian modernity kind of line coming from Lino Baggio and the kind of fascist infected kind of problematics within that, which happened in São Paulo in the early 1900s. We have the Brasilia comes from a line which emerges within Puritanism with Les Enfants and Honoré. So it has that kind of line is very, very different from the more Russian constructivist or Dutch lines which the constructivists refer to. So yes, it's a kind of a pedantic complaint, but I think it's quite important to acknowledge the existence of these different and sometimes contradictory genealogies. And finally, with Nina's paper, I quite like the idea of looking at concretism as translation, but I would kind of look at it in a different way, perhaps. Kind of, in object. And here, maybe Brasilia has a kind of is kind of equally arrogant in its kind of as a statement as neo-concretism was arrogant. But if we read the manifesto on the theory of neo-concrete by Goulart, we see Goulart stating European modernism almost as a translation of Brazilian, of neo-concretism, a kind of an inversion, in that for Goulart, the neo-concrete object was the pure apparition, the pure object, an object that even the Europeans hadn't understood could be so pure. So in a sense, kind of Goulart, very arrogantly, is kind of putting straight European modernism from this kind of correcting it from its error, which kind of is a kind of translation in English, I think I'll let that be.
Thank you, Michael. Would you like to comment, any one of you?
Well, maybe, yes, I would comment first on what Susanne said, maybe. Well, you touched a very central point of the research on neo-concretism, which is the question if we essentialize our gaze or emphasize the on-the-body aspect in Brazilian neo-concrete art, and especially we see this in the exhibitions on Gia Clark and Oiticica that have taken place in European countries. And yes, it is very difficult to not step into this trap, but I precisely used the figure of translation to not fall into this trap of essentializing, because in the end the objects they were handled, and the touch is an essential part of it. So I think it is not a possibility to just exclude the topic of touch from them, or from talking about these objects. So yeah, it's really quite difficult not to step into the trap. Still keep talking about the idea of touch, and so this is why I said that it is also the idea of how the artworks are institutionalized that maybe differently, that plays a central role, because, well, maybe I can mention one of our experiences we had when we went to the Oiticica, last Oiticica show shown in Frankfurt in 2013, because there were touchable and non-touchable objects, and the first room that was where touchable objects were, the apologies actually. Not all of them were touchable, but this was not clear from the beginning, because there was a sign of a hand on the wall that was supposed to indicate that the objects were touchable. So in the first place, we went there and thought that everything was touchable in the room, and then I remember that I approached an object and wanted to touch, and then suddenly one of the museum staff came up and said, "No, it's not possible to touch, please. It's only this one and this, but not this one." And it's indicated on the plate directly below the object. So, and this initial experience, I think, made quite clear the difficulty of this behavior regime the White Cube has, because after that I was quite anxious about touching another object, because I was always looking for, is there really a sign, is it really touchable? Looking at the museum stuff, can I really touch it, or is it not possible? So I think this is a central question. Yes, maybe you want to.
Yeah, thank you very much for your response. Well, very interesting to see. Kind of, this is also kind of taking another point of view, because we're receiving another point of view. So, I just wanted to say 2 points. One is the thing of the perspectives, and of course it's clear that when I do research on a particular situation here in Germany or Switzerland, there should be this counter point of view of the Brazilian thing. As far as I see, there are a lot of archival material, of course, which come from Brazil. So you have this situation where there's a double thing happening. So you have the archive here, you have the archive there, you have the letters from Rio, here in Nuremberg. So the task is actually, what I think is really to compare and see where are the gaps, to have a bit fuller. And the other thing, I think it is complicated. This is what I can say so far, to do research on the 50s. And to deal, you asked about this question, is there a blind spot, or the example of Ludwig Grote. I was very surprised to see that he was kind of unimportant, because maybe it was a question of generation in his case, because he was like at the end of his career, and this was also tried to show in my paper that how can we deal with this attitude of exhibition organizer or art historian who's doing just kind of, it has the impression it's doing what the state wants him to do. And this is what he really is interested in, and how can we take his position seriously still, and not say, well, this is just Cold War political, post-war culture in a way. And what I want to add, which is also very surprising, what you also said, that this difficult time after the war, that so far I was very surprised to see that, I mean, in one letter I said to see the new German art. This is what the Brazilians professor. They want to, of course, know what this means, but still I didn't feel there was any kind of distance to Germany. So that really the will to include, and of course they organized, they set up this office of foreign exhibitions. So they were really there to organize exhibitions that travel abroad, etc. So, but maybe it's a question of time also, so maybe we have to open.
Yeah, I think Lena has a question. Can I just make one very 30-second comment? Susanne, the director of MAN São Paulo, Wolfgang Pfeiffer, he was a German. Is there any connection between him and Wolfgang Grote letters?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They meet later. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, there was just this correspondence. So Pfeiffer was the one who was.
He was the Brazilian connection, maybe.
Yeah.
Our man, unser Mann in Brasilien. Okay.
So actually, I have a question on the exhibition in Nuremberg. Like at first in '59, there was the Haus der Kunst in Munich, and then the second one in 1916 in the Kunsthalle in Nuremberg.
Yes.
So why did they choose Nuremberg, like for this traveling exhibition? Because like with the just because of his.
There are two different exhibitions. The one is '59 Haus der Kunst, which is called the Exhibition of the Brazilian artists.
Okay.
That was not organized by Grote. He just wrote the introduction because they thought he was the one who could say something about Brazil. And 1960, the La Paz exhibition in Nuremberg, that was Grote himself. So he had kind of his office there. He had his secretary who organized all the things from Nuremberg to Brazil, etc. So it was kind of a little international office in Nuremberg. And as he knew the widow of Segal very well, and so he just tried to. But he was also responsible for the Frankische Gallery, so we had to do four.
Yeah, so I think it's really
four exhibitions of
extraordinary.
Contemporary, which actually is a contemporary, not contemporary art in the 1960s to show Segal's age.
I think we have. Sorry. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll take a break. Please, I saw a hand here.
Yes. I wonder, I make the question short and therefore probably more provocative, whether the exhibition of Laza Segal counts as an example of reception of Brazilian art in post-war Europe so much, or whether he is not rather, at least in this show, displayed as an example of European what I have in mind is, of course, that by the time there is already a template of a Brazilian artist that is strongly influenced by through France and the reception of the first modernists through Sondras and so forth, but then also the big Brazil Bills show in, I think, 1943 in New York, and the very early reception in the United States of Brazilian modernist architecture. So a rather different idea of modernity than expression. It's just a question whether there is really a Brazilianness attributed to Segal's work in that particular show.
The show was a retrospective, so the early work was the one I showed these sketches from 1970, which was actually from the series who were also in the Detrital Art exhibition in Munich in 37, I think, and so from the whole period. So Segal in this case is of course like a European, was shown as a forgotten European artist, but also like a Brazilian artist. And I could read from the introduction from Grote, he really went through all this kind of development. So he did not say he's a Brazilian, he did not say.
Okay,
But which is why he was interested in.
I'll give the word now to Susanne and then we'll wrap up.
Just to come back to Brasilia, I just wanted to,
Susanne,
to mention Brasilia as the maybe most relevant example. But of course, Brasilia is only one of the phenomena of this international modernist discourse. And I think very important is to make the difference what made in the beginning. It's a top-down, Brasilia was a top-down project, and also this German art policy in the post-war was top-down. But there are all these other projects which come from above, and this is very interesting. And we have a whole phenomenon, a transatlantic phenomenon, and I would even say a phenomenon which goes much beyond the transatlantic dimension in the 50s. Because I visited Chandigarh, for example, in India, and you have a very similar project in India, to Brasilia. So I think the history is very complex. So we have to take into account all these different actors. Yeah? And maybe I'm doubting a bit if we reach very far with the cultural differences. And translation in the Brazilian case is a bit dangerous, because there is a very strong Brazilian translation theory. And this Brazilian translation theory is the appropriation theory which comes from the anthropophagia. And this is a bit dangerous for the project, I think, because all we who work on translation and Brazilian literature and so on, we know that Adolfo Campos, they all made out of anthropophagia a very, very interesting translation theory. So I would take this.
Yes,
and you have this anthropophagia, you answer in the corporeal space.
Yes, but anthropophagia, I actually don't want to use anthropophagia because it's from the 20s and then was taken out of the 60s.
It's entered in translation theory very strongly with Adolfo Campos and Marie Araujo. Araujo. She's a theorist of a very Brazilian translation theory, and it's very actual. If you investigate a bit, you can find a very Brazilian translation theory based on appropriation and on the idea of anthropophagia.
Does this refer only to textual translation?
Textual translation, in fact, I don't doubt that very soon will come also in the art sphere. I think associate immediately translation theory.
Okay, colleagues, I think we have to take a break now. discussion is always, there's always a very hard duty for the one who sits here and says, okay, let's finish discussing, because it gets more and more interesting actually as we go along. But we have a schedule to follow, so thank you so much. Two Susannes and one Pauline for this very Michael and Glenna who contributed also to this very interesting discussion. Thank you so much.